Welcome to this opening keynote at the Buxton Battle of Ideas. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas. But not, you know. Feels a bit superfluous. But anyway, are the culture wars a distraction? And we were asked by Mo to realise that the topics that we're discussing today are not simple and not straightforward. And I think that's really true, because in the midst of it all, the idea that you'd have a row about whether you use pronouns or not, whether you, having rows about toilets and whether they should be unisex, having rows about whether road names can be changed, it does sometimes feel a bit trivial when there's anti-Jewish pogroms, there's war in Europe, there's thousands being killed in Gaza, there's a cost of living crisis and genuine hardship. That's not just a phrase, genuine hardship in terms of an economy that's stagnating. There's climate change. Some would say that's the crisis. So you can choose your crisis, right? But it sometimes feels like there's these huge problems and then there's people like me banging on about pronouns. And so it can feel as though the culture wars are indeed a distraction. We also know that they're divisive and they're toxic. We're in a situation now where the way that politics is conducted is through name-calling. And it's like stupid like in the playground, but it can actually be, you know, the difference between having a job or not, whether you get called a TERF or whether somebody labels you a racist or what have you. But I think all sides are guilty of this, you know. The kind of people who sort of call people woke snowflakes, who are maybe on my side, are no better than the people who are on the other side. So I think that we want to, here, try and dig a bit deeper. And it is an issue close to my heart. I have, at the House of Lords, when I've raised issues around, for example, my concerns around critical race theory, and issues on white privilege being used in a particular way, or when I've raised the issues of gender and trans ideology being taught in schools and so on, I have been accused of being a culture warrior, usually an alt-right culture warrior, probably funded by far-right US Christian groups. That's the sort of general thing. And definitely an extremist. So I do think we want to go beyond that and dig a bit deeper. One thing I want to say is I know that what we've done with the panel, it's an excellent panel, is it's not a black and white issue. It's not, are you for or against the proposition? We're not playing some school debating competition here. Nothing wrong with them. We run one ourselves called Debate Matters. But we're all the grown-ups in the room. And we've got to go beyond and just think, actually, there are problems with this issue that we should discuss frankly and openly. So that's what I've asked them to do. However, I've only given them 5 to 6 minutes each, so it's a bit of an ordeal, right? The format, in case you haven't been to any Battle of Ideas before, and I know some of you are new to this, so some of you are old hands, is that after the speakers have done their 5 to 6 minutes each, we go out to the audience and we take clusters of 4, 5, 6 contributions from the audience and then come back to the panel to just reflect on anything they want. There are people who sometimes say, I asked a question and they never answered it, but it's not really like that, right? It's much more, you raise an issue and I ask the panel to reflect on all the issues they've heard, come back quickly, then we'll go back out, then we'll come back and so on. In other words, the whole point of this is a series of public conversations. That's what we're trying to do, to have a conversation with each other. Okay, let me introduce our speakers in the order they'll speak. I'm not giving their full biographies, which are very impressive, but they're on the website, so do take a look. We're going to start with Stephen Knight, who is a reporter and podcaster. I'm absolutely delighted Stephen's agreed, because he's one of the most rational people around in terms of discussion, in my opinion. He's the host of the Knight Discussion Show, Knight as in K-N-I-G-H-T, Knight Tube, sorry, the Knight Tube Discussion Show, even ruined the title. And that Knight Tube Discussion Show has candid conversations with an eclectic array of guests, ranging from scientists and authors to activists and comedians. And he's all about challenging dogma and exploring the impact of bad ideology. So he's the perfect person to have speaking. We're then going to hear from Cheryl Hudson, who is a lecturer in US political history at the University of Liverpool. She's former director of the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. She spoke on the session on Trumpism at the London Battle of Ideas, which quite a lot of people have told me was the best panel they've ever been to, and a fantastic discussion. So thanks for contributing to that. She's co-editor of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, also co-editor of a very important publication called Why Academic Freedom Matters, and her forthcoming book is Citizenship in Chicago, Race, Culture and the Remaking of American Identity. And I'm delighted Cheryl's joining us. We're then going to hear from Simon Calvert, who is the Deputy Director of Public Affairs at the Christian Institute. He's been at the Christian Institute since qualifying as a solicitor in 1996, and he's one of those Christians that we all keep being warned against, right? The truth is that he gives advice on the impact of legislation to parliamentarians like me, on free speech and freedom of religion. And I'm an atheist, but I have to say that I find the Christian Institute briefings invaluable to read. I don't always agree with them, but they're well-informed, evidence-based, and I know that Simon's responsible for that, so I appreciate it. And also, part of his work is helping Christians who are discriminated against because of their faith, which seems to me to be a worthy cause. We're then going to hear from Dr. Remy Adekeo, who's a politics lecturer at the University of York. Before joining academia, Remy was a journalist and has written for almost every national newspaper, and has also given political analysis and commentary for international TV and radio broadcasters literally all over the world. His latest book is making a real splash and is on sale at the bookshop, so you should rush out and buy it after this if you haven't got it already. It's called It's Not About Whiteness, It's About Wealth. He also spoke at the London Festival and made much appreciated contributions. Since 2021, Remy's also been a member of the Home Office Strategic Race Board, so is increasingly having an important role in policy, I hope. We're then going to finally hear from Bruno Waterfield, who actually was not able to speak at the London Battle of Ideas, and I think it was the first time that he didn't speak in the whole history of the Battle of Ideas. We've been going for 16, 17 years now, and we really missed him, so I'm delighted he's with us. He's come all the way from Brussels to Buxton, because he's the Brussels correspondent for The Times, and Bruno's been reporting and commenting on European affairs for 20 years, and has reported from the capital of EU for the Daily Telegraph before we had the referendum 2006 to 2015. You'll be delighted to know, I think I can say this to a relatively home crowd, that Bruno gave a balanced view of Brexit in mainstream media, and for which he deserves a medal. Can we welcome them all, please? Stephen, your thoughts?
Thank you, Claire. So it seems to me that the only way you can really dismiss the culture war as a mere distraction is if you've no great interest in our culture, or you haven't noticed the way in which the culture war has stifled our ability to think out loud or challenge bad ideas. Many people will hand-wave away this issue as some sort of imaginary problem, but unfortunately the casualties of the culture war are very real, as are the consequences of ignoring it. Those of us that claim the right to think out loud have noticed the consequences of doing so on certain issues. There appears to be an approved script for the big issues of our day, and this script is almost exclusively written by what's called the so-called progressive left. I still count myself as a man of the left. I'm just hanging in there. So I'm very concerned about all the damage this is doing to liberal leftist causes too, one of which would be to empower the sort of nationalist religious right by somehow managing to make them seem more appealing. If this was just one big insignificant slanging match between the woke and the anti-woke, akin to sort of football rivalry, we could just happily ignore it and get on with the important stuff. The problem is not that the culture war simply distracts us from getting on with the important stuff, it's that it makes it impossible. The foot soldiers of the culture war are well embedded within our media, our police force, our academia, our politics, our HR departments and so on. So this has had a notable effect on the everyday life of regular people. There are people who don't even realise they've been conscripted into the culture war until they go viral on the internet, or get marched into their HR department for saying something that was uncontroversial a whole 5 minutes ago. Nowhere has this become more pronounced than on the topic of gender. The general public know the tenets of gender ideology are at best false and at worst deeply regressive. This is why our elected officials are now frequently being asked the question, what is a woman? Something no one could have predicted 5 years ago. And because asking them this one simple question is a shortcut to revealing whether they've been utterly captured by a nonsensical worldview, or just how willing they are to protect tribal falsehoods over reality. Women's hard-won sex-based rights have been jeopardised by this aspect of the culture war. A growing number of women are now organising in protest, and when I report from these demonstrations and ask them how they will be voting in the next election, invariably they simply tell me they will vote for the person that can tell them what a woman is. That's how important this issue has become for ordinary people with reasonable concerns about their rights. Women are also finding themselves in trouble with the police for vocally defending the concept of biological sex. Just this month in the northeast, a woman was interviewed at a local police station and banned from her beloved Newcastle football club for tweeting that men aren't women. And we're only hearing about her really because this was reported in the newspapers. And I'm wondering how many regular, decent folk have been on the receiving end of this type of treatment and have just gone quietly into the night, having no support, no recourse, or no desire to fight because of the fear of what their friends and family may think of them. And this sort of stifling culture around what can say or think can have grave consequences. I'm sure you'll all remember the jihadist suicide bombing at a pop concert in my home city in 2017. 22 mostly teenage girls were murdered that day, and an investigation was concluded in 2020 into the security of that event. And some rather interesting facts were revealed that I think deserve more reflection than they appear to have had. For instance, it was revealed that a member of the public had seen the suicide bomber, Salman Abedi, hanging around before he carried out his attack, and he was reported to security, being described as looking dodgy. After receiving this info, a young security guard got eyes on Salman Abedi from a distance of around 10 feet and instantly had what he described as a bad feeling about him. However, this particular security guard decided not to approach Salman Abedi or investigate further. He revealed to the investigation his reasons, and I quote, "I was scared of being branded a racist if I got it wrong. I would have got into trouble. It made me hesitant." This is a direct product of the utter derangement and obsession with the issue of skin colour that the culture war has demanded of us. The fear of being labelled a racist in that moment generated more concern for this young man than a potential terrorist. The culture war has stifled our instincts and demands that we reject our common senses. Some of you may even believe you're safe because you have the right on correct viewpoints of the day, or you're on the right side of history. But unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be a statute of limitations on what will place you in the firing line either. Comments you made 5 or 10 years ago may be wheeled out to destroy your life because they contradict the sort of newest, unalterable truth. This is so common now that it has been given the name outrage archaeology. Not even death can free you from the culture war, as we've seen from revisionist rhetoric around people such as Judy Garland, Winston Churchill and John Wayne. So, I mean, even people born in 1907 are expected to be woke. So to me, the culture war simply represents a pushback to what are simply falsehoods and harmful ideas forced upon us by authoritarians. And there are always consequences for remaining silent in the face of bullies. So I'd just like to finish by saying it's never a waste of time nor a distraction to defend the principles of truth and free expression from its enemies. Thank you.
Perfectly timed and perfectly pitched, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheryl, your thoughts, please.
Thank you, Claire. So I think it's hard to resist the dynamics of the culture war, but I think we should try. I'm quite resistant to choosing a side in the culture wars. It's a common demand these days that you have to pick a side. Well, I've never actually been shy about arguing for my political position. I'm not a fence sitter, but I refuse to choose a side on the terms offered by the culture wars, and I'll try to explain why. So first we should get straight what it is we are talking about. We're not fighting over the relative qualities of Tolstoy over Dickens or the merits of Picasso over Michelangelo. No one is getting dragged on Twitter for liking brutalist over Gothic architecture. You know, the culture wars that we're talking about relate not to high culture, although sometimes they do get pulled in, but to the cultures of meaning that we inhabit in our everyday lives. So the culture wars are an expansive category, but they usually revolve around a number of kind of heated topics relating to questions of who we are, rather than what we want, which has been the traditional ground of politics. They're usually rooted in identity, based on shared characteristics, often immutable characteristics of race, sex, gender, nationality, sexuality, ethnicity, and so on. And they can be very tribal. They often involve gesture politics or virtue signalling. So it's not the left, the right of politics, but the right and the wrong in a kind of moral way. They're often a form of entertainment too, a spectacle that we can all watch and appreciate while we root for our team. Sometimes they offer an emotional outlet for righteous outrage. Often a lot of flags are involved, and a lot of the alphabet too, so LGBTQ+, BLM, and so on. And we wave the flag that best represents our identity group to perform for the world, our audience, the kind of people that we are. So it's very performative. They also usually involve a claim to victim status in what's been called the oppression Olympics. So if you can show that your group has suffered the most at the hands of the most evil oppressor, then you win moral high ground points. They're usually, though, transient and temporary, which is really at odds with how culture used to be understood, something that prevailed and was handed down on through the generations. The culture wars are always moving on to the next big current thing. The speed at which people took down their BLM flags and replaced them with the Ukraine flag, and now the Israeli or the Palestinian flag, is pretty incredible. And it denotes, I think, a lack of real seriousness, a superficiality in the discussion. And even things like Israel-Gaza, which should be the ground for serious politics, has become a culture war in the West. So it's all about the identities of the two main ethnic groups involved. Whose side are you on? Which flag should you wave? How it's so important that you demonstrate that your group is the biggest victim and is confronted with the greatest risk. You don't really have to know anything about it. You just have to pick a side. And these clashes are not usually about what they purport to be about. There's a lot of obfuscation. There's a real hall of mirrors at work. And this is, I think, because they are epiphenomenal. That is, they are a secondary feature of a deeper underlying problem. And that problem, for me, is the absence of politics and the possibility of change. Our societies are experiencing a loss of hope about the future and our ability to change it. We seem kind of stuck. So there's a kind of narcissism of small differences where you have, the way I think about it is, we have like these different groups standing on opposite sides of a rail track, shouting at each other while the train continues on, whether that train is neoliberalism or globalization or modernization or whatever it is that you want to change. It just keeps on going down the track while we shout at each other across the tracks. The liberalism that animated Western societies had within it, right, I think, from its very inception, the seeds of its own destruction. There was a failure to deliver on the promises that it offered of freedom, of equality, and of continual progress and advancement. At first, the chinks were small, and groups that were left out of these promises, women, blacks, gays, and others, were able to use its promises in order to demand equality. But over the course of the 20th century, that tragic flaw in liberal society has become increasingly apparent to more and more people. So that from around the 1960s and 70s, they've turned away from it entirely. But the train continues, along with declines in social cohesion, in social bonds of trust, and an ongoing atomization and isolation of the individual. The corresponding rise in identity politics and the culture wars was, I think, the answer to our need, our continued need for social connection, our need for bonding and belonging in a society that has no sense of purpose or collective means of bringing about positive change. So for me, the problem is not that the culture wars distract us, but that they are a dead end. The form that they take and the mode that they operate in is a divisive deadlock, which means that the culture wars cause us many more problems than they solve.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that was really useful, Cheryl, as it were, putting a fly in the ointment and helping us do a kind of deep dive into the subject. So thank you very much for that. Simon, your thoughts, please.
Well, there's a cartoon doing the rounds on social media, and it shows a badge-wearing activist making an increasingly unreasonable set of demands of a bystander. He wants him to use certain words, celebrate certain values, wave particular flags, vote a certain way, and so on. And in each panel of the cartoon, his demands meet with silence from the bystander, until the final panel, where the bystander calmly responds with the simple word, no. And the activist becomes furious, and he points to the bystander and he shouts, "Stop provoking culture wars." And this is the way that the term culture wars is now being used. Whatever it meant in the past, in the UK today, it's very often just a dismissive accusation made against those who refuse to go along with other people's political demands. It's manipulative. It's gaslighting. It's a way of turning the victim into the perpetrator, turning the passive bystander into the aggressor. And it's a technique for activists to get their own way. I was recently quoted alongside Stonewall on a BBC News Online thing, and Stonewall wants a conversion therapy ban specifically modelled after Victoria in Australia, where parents who refuse to go along with their children being prescribed puberty blockers are being told by the state that they're committing unlawful conversion therapy. The penalties include jail time. Parents of gender-confused kids are living in fear of being arrested simply for trying to protect their own children from trans ideology and the terrible physical consequences it can have. I think it's perfectly reasonable to argue that the UK should not go down that route. But the Stonewall spokesperson told the BBC that disagreeing with them was just a cynical culture war. So this is where we are. People demand unreasonable things, and when we say, "I'm sorry, I can't go along with that," they start accusing us of stoking culture wars. But they are the culture warriors. They are the ones trying to rewrite our values and history. They are the ones turning corporations into campaigns. They are the ones trying to compel us to say things that we don't believe. As you've heard, I work for the Christian Institute, and I'm an evangelical Christian. I believe in things, and I believe that those things are worth standing up for. I'm a campaigner. I believe in the power of argument because the truth is true. And I believe in debate, and I believe in learning from other people, but I don't pretend that I'm neutral. Those who throw around the term culture wars to dismiss other people's opinions are, I think, being dishonest. Because, of course, they too have beliefs that they're fighting for, but they're winning by pretending to be doing something else. They're using sleight of hand, don't look over here, look over there. They don't have the courage to defend their ideas in robust debate. They try to insulate their beliefs from criticism by saying that anyone who disagrees is just a divisive culture warrior. Whereas the reality, of course, is that I have views and you have views and they have views, and we just have to get used to it. Of course, the culture wars aren't real wars. we're just talking about disagreement. And I do believe we should try to disagree well. I think the old injunction to love your neighbour means you have to take your neighbour's arguments seriously and respond with kindness where you can. So, in conclusion, I think to say the culture wars are a distraction is itself a distraction. And so, my message today, my sort of Billy Graham evangelistic appeal or whatever, is this: don't be fooled, don't give in, don't let them win, stand up for what's right, get involved, get active. The other side don't want you to fight back, they want to demoralize you, don't let them. And call out their dishonesty and manipulation when they claim neutrality, when in reality they are the culture war aggressors. Thank you.
All I can say, Simon, is Billy Graham would be proud of you. Okay, Remy, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. So I'll try to give a little bit of an outsider perspective on the culture wars here in the UK and generally speaking in the West. Even though I've lived in the UK for 9 years now and I'm happily settled down here, I did spend the first 30-something years of my life living in different countries. I grew up in Nigeria, where I was born and raised. My father was a Nigerian. And then afterwards, I moved to Poland, where I also lived for many years. So I have a little bit of an outsider perspective on this, and we'll try to see what I think is going on here. So we talk about culture a lot, and we talk about culture wars. I try to look for a good definition of culture out there. And there's various fancy academic definitions of culture, which often are incredibly boring, and you have to read 3 times to be able to understand. And so I settled on one which I really liked from one of the most prominent American cultural anthropologists of the 20th century called Clifford Geertz, who said culture boils down to the stories we tell ourselves, about who we are as a nation, as a people, as an ethnic group, or any other social community. I would add that the most important aspects of these stories are those about who we were in the past, who we are today, and who we should be tomorrow. While in every nation, various peoples and groups offer varying answers to these questions, some will emphasize the importance of existing traditions, others will emphasize the importance of progressive new traditions, it is symptomatic that the term culture wars is only really used to define public debates in the West, in countries like Britain. No one talks about culture wars happening in Africa, in Asia, or Latin America, even though there are various vigorous debates in these countries on various issues that would be described as cultural, ranging from the role of women in society to issues around the role of religion. But these issues don't seem to define public debate elsewhere as they do here in the West. I would argue this is for 2 reasons. First of all, most countries in the world are not wealthy countries. Most countries in the world are either poor countries or relatively poor countries. And so the predominant issues people are preoccupied with in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America are economic issues. And elections fought in those countries are often fought around the issue of how do we improve our economies, how do we bring economic development to our country. So economic issues are primary issues in many other places. These are less urgent issues in affluent countries, and it happens that many Western countries are affluent countries, or pretty much all Western countries are affluent countries. And so economics is not that much of a key factor here. Another reason why I think there's this culture wars here in the West is that no people today are more uncertain about who they were in the past, who they are today, and who they should be tomorrow than Western societies, such as Britain. So you have these never-ending debates over whether Britain has a past to be proud of or ashamed of, or whether America has a past to be proud of or ashamed of, over what today's Britain is, and perhaps most importantly, over what tomorrow's Britain should be. Debates over what the British Empire was, over its role in colonialism and slavery, define the contestations over the past. As for the debate over what Britain is today, I'd say the key dispute is over whether today's Britain is a fundamentally fair society with some more or less avoidable inequalities, some discrimination, and some generally negative aspects, or whether Britain is a fundamentally unfair society with enormous inequalities of all kinds, significant discrimination, and many, many things that require changing. And these are the two dividing lines of the culture wars, as I'd say here. And this leads us to the key question over what kind of society Britain should be in the future. Every society needs a vision to aspire to, or it becomes listless and uncertain about what the whole point is really. This is particularly true of affluent societies that are no longer preoccupied simply with survival. So what's the point of moving forward if we don't really know where we want to get to? The left, I'd say, with all its inconsistencies, has a definable vision of the promised land. It is broadly encapsulated around the ideas of EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And so the left does have a 1-minute pitch for what they want Britain to look like in the future. And they can say, look, we want a future Britain that is more equal, whether it comes to race, gender equality, and other forms of equality. We want a future Britain that is diverse, and one where all the diverse groups are represented in the everyday decision-making processes of British society. That's what they can say. Debates over race, gender, or sexual identity boil down to debates over whether Britain is doing enough to reach this promised land of EDI. And those who would argue from the left side would always say it is definitely not doing enough. However, I would say a bigger issue is that I have no idea what the right's vision of the promised land is for Britain. I have an idea of the right's vision of the past and of the present, but not about its vision of what Britain should be tomorrow. It's not enough to say we need to conserve and maintain what we have as a nation, from the British point of view, because that doesn't inspire people to a goal. And like I mentioned, without a goal, people flounder. And it certainly doesn't inspire young people, because every new generation wants to feel that they can change the world for the better. And you either respond to that desire or you lose them. So I'd say that for the whole debate around the culture wars to be more than a critique of one side's vision, those unhappy with the current culture wars need to present their own vision of what Britain should be tomorrow. Their own vision of a promised land, and it best be a vision of a promised land filled with lots of milk and honey. Thank you.
Thanks, Remy. I think that outsider's view is really helpful at giving you a completely different perspective, but one that really helps, again, as I say, dig deeper. So, Bruno, to finish off.
I think I'd agree with Cheryl and with Simon how infuriating, even maddening the culture wars are. They're profoundly distasteful and really show us quite often the decline in basic decency and manners. But, unfortunately, you might not be interested in the war, but it is interested in you. You're in the sights of, as Stephen said, senior police officers, employers, should someone inform on you. Lots of the public sector are against you. Universities, schools, and a whole army of people who are trolling through social media to uncover you. And one of the most disturbing parts of the atmosphere in the culture wars is denouncing and informing is now de rigueur. It shows that you're a good political activist if you can grasp someone up, if you can inform on them, denounce them, and get them fired. So it's a big deal, whether we like it or whether we don't like it. What's actually going on is a redefinition of how we live, literally how we live. I talked about manners, for corrosion of manners, for tearing down of what makes us who we are, and quite often what we hold dear. It is about meaning, and meaning is very important to be in charge, to be able to determine yourself meaning, to be able to determine yourself the language you use to describe meaning, our communities, our lives, is deeply, profoundly basic and important.
Up here in High Peak and the Derbyshire Dales, which voted to leave the European Union, you must have heard the expression, the left behind. It's a very irritating trope, and it's often seen as an economic concept applied to those who benefited less from modern capitalism and globalization. But it's not. It's a moral framing. Even in the economic sense, there's a patronizing regard in the term for those who don't have degrees, working in jobs that are seen as having little worth, or living in communities that are almost regarded almost as alien cultures. He must have read stories and features in newspapers and magazines where an intrepid journalist comes from down south, usually, and goes and explores Boston, maybe, in Lincolnshire, or maybe even further up north in Teesside, or maybe the Scousers. And there's this real sense of going into this dark realm, discovering tribes who have these horrible habits, like almost as bad as cannibalism. So the real essence of the marker left behind is one of inferiority. We left behind are fated to be, as they always say, the wrong side of history, because in the way we live, we put our attachments and our commitments first, resisting, conserving our way of life against the tide, quite often against what we are told and how we are told to behave, the etiquette. So these wars over our culture, over our meaning, are not a dumb distraction at all. They are an assault on how we make sense of the world and the principles, the feelings, lived traditions, and essence of how we live our lives with others. Yes, they're predicated in many ways or based on the absence of politics, but they're actually the way in which the absence of politics is then turned into structural difference between the morally superior, the finger waggers, and the morally inferior, the people who live our lives in these left behind, alien, scary places across our country. Cultural debates can rage with arguments that seem trivial or abstract, but often each is important in its own right. They're often transient, but they're cumulative. These battles have real consequences, not just in terms of what can happen to individuals, but the real consequences is that they corrode, even dissolve like acid, some of the key tenets, principles, and foundations that sustain us, our communities, our families, our freedom. So the stakes are high. To be on the wrong side in the culture wars is to be branded as a moral inferior, on the wrong side of history. That's why we can be grassed up. That's why we can be denounced. That's why it's okay to inform on people. Each and every culture war reinforces the sway of a new elite. It's still in formation, but most definitely in the driving seat, which is defined by markers of their superiority, a new establishment of the finger waggers ruling over us, the less educated multitude. So it's a move to a new elite. I called it a clerisy, and people have called it a clerisy, with the removal of contest, challenge, and the closing down of any clashes of alternatives from politics. It's a rule not defined not by a boot stamping on a human face, as Orwell put it, by dictatorship, old-fashioned dictatorship, but it begins with an indifference to defending freedom, particularly free speech. And it becomes an order, which we're seeing emerging at the moment, which is defined through a culture of intolerant conformism, often posing as radical or orthodoxy, around the use of words and language. So culture wars are the militant expression of an ideology that devalues our moral worth, the moral worth of individuals, our moral worth, a majority who live outside the world of the alleged expertise and knowledge of those who want to instruct us. In many ways, the more radical and transgressive the assault, it seems absolutely incredible that the biological difference between a man and a woman can be so contested, the more corrosive It is how we live together as men, women with attachments and commitments to our families and communities, living in territories with borders as peoples or nations is disrupted as never before. In fact, the very idea that you should have boundaries or borders are anathema, and they're anathema because they're bulwarks, they're bastions for our lives, for what constitutes us as individuals, but also as a people, also as a nation. So at stake here, at the very least, is political equality, the foundation of all politics, as most of us become defined as morally inferior. We just do not get it. But much worse is the stigma, the problematization in the jargon, the stripping away of the common or conventional understandings of how we view the world and what we need to live in it. And that's really a really deadly dissolution, because it undermines what we need for resilience and strength, for strength to do battle in a world that is becoming much more uncertain, much more dangerous, and much more difficult.
Thank you. Thanks. That was actually very moving, Bruno. Thank you. You did say that one way that people are cancelled is because people troll through your social media, but I don't want that to put you off using Twitter or X with the hashtag BattleFest, because the more of us who do it, the better, saying that we're here. Okay, it's over to you now. Let's start and get a few points and questions.
Cheryl, I'm interested when you say, look, what we're not talking about in the culture wars is culture, for example, Dickens, because it seems that we often are. Picasso is cancelled, you go to the Tate Gallery, see Hogarth, and there is signs, almost don't see this picture because it's in contact with colonialism. So there does seem to be quite a lot of wanting to cancel actual culture. And I guess, Remy, in your thing about saying, well, the right should have a sense of the future, I mean, in some ways that's hard because it's that idea of the battle of preserving the past at the moment. And in many ways you think young people want to rip things up, and that's completely right, and they should do. But presumably it's old people's responsibility to give them the best of the past so that they can rip things up, so they know what they're ripping up. I mean, it seems to me the problem at the moment is we're not giving them anything, and I guess it's attractive for the left to go, just rip it up and we'll help you rip it up. There seems to be, surely our job is conserving.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, panel. Found that very interesting. My observations really are, we've always had a culture war, for 100,000 years. Every tribe, every community is always rubbing up against each other because new ideas are always coming to the fore. What's happened here is several things. So part of the reason it's a problem today is because of the internet, how we can communicate with each other at a click of a button, share ideas that we never would have heard somebody in a different part of the country, different part of the world would have had these ideas. We never would have known about it. The fact that we're also, we seem to forget sometimes that we're a tribal creature. We need a leader. We need something to belong to. That's what football matches are about. That's why people scream and shout at the terraces. They want to belong. And what we've been doing now in our country for 100 years is we've been chipping away at the nation state. There's nothing to belong to anymore. Yeah. And to fill that void, we're looking externally. Oh, I'm gay. I want to belong to the gay group. I'm this, I'm that. I want to belong to that group, because there's no more patriotism. There's no more looking at your country. Waving the country's flag is now disrespected. And that's what the culture war is about. It's about our innate desire to want to belong to something more and bigger than what we are. And the answer to the question is, we need to replace that, and we need to replace that with the nation state. Okay, thank you very much.
I'm like a stuck record, I keep saying this every time. There's nothing complicated about this. Basically, it's neo-Marxist, elitist separatism, shitting on all of us consistently. Everybody knows this, there's a slew of books about it. It's all about the proletariat didn't bring about a revolution. There's something wrong with the proletariat. Let's replace them. Back to Frankfurt School initially, women, Marcuse comes along, the ghetto, it's blacks, it's gays, LGBT, etc. Meld with postmodernism, of course, which is the way of actually denying debate. That's all it is. It's nothing more complicated than that. There's no two sides about it. It's not a war. It's the elitist separatism of a wannabe elite wanting to shit on us completely, produce ground zero, and as if by some magic, some totally new society arises, as if we don't have human nature. It's total bollocks.
Now, the only problem with that contribution is that nothing complicated about it dismisses this panel. Secondly, it's like reading a series of memes strung together, right? Fine, but you know what I mean? I think it is complicated. There's you two, yes. All right, I'll take you.
The only problem with that neo-Marxist idea is that a lot of this, actually, if you recall, started immediately after the Brexit 2016 referendum. And the actual communists were, of course, pro-Brexit. The people who do this properly knew which side they were fighting for, and they made sure that we left the European Union. And it's the grief, frankly, that the Remainists had after having unexpectedly lost in 2016 that has driven this reaction, this mad anti-racism, which has since developed into a very chauvinistic gender ideology. It's still driven essentially by the regret the Remainists still have, because they will not reconcile themselves to the fact that they lost. Paralleled in America by the loss to Donald Trump of the first serious female candidate for presidency. And yet, it is obvious where the growth has to happen. It is democratic, and it's because of the Remainists having lost that they are suspicious of the democracy that fires all the rest of us.
I was interested in the point that Cheryl... Oh, speak up. Oh, stand up, sure. I was interested in the point of Cheryl Hudson on the culture wars as being temporal and transient, more like... And the way I understood it was more like an expression or a desire of being heard and screaming at each other, but the actual processes of the world, the actual machine, if you will, keeps marching on, or the train keeps driving. So the actual political decisions are out of their hands either way. And in that way, you could see the culture wars as a distraction. So I'm actually interested in that and wondering if there might be something more to that the bureaucracy is more or less unaffected by the culture wars, and therefore it is a bit of a distraction because the functions or the governmental procedures don't really change necessarily that much. And maybe it's easier to espouse platitudes on certain levels of equality rather than actually introducing true equality, such as lifting impoverished families or impoverished people out of poverty. It's easier to say, well, we see you as an equal member of society even though you have this denominator, if that makes sense.
Thanks very, very much to the panel. Really, really great start to the day. And picking up on the essence of what was said is that the culture wars is very much about dividing us, and that we do need a vision for the future that we can all share. And picking up a bit on what people are saying, the nation state, I think, is so important because we live here. This is the bit of the world we inhabit. And if we want to have some say in the future and where we're going, it's a practical way forward of recognising that this is where we are. And I think this is the seeds of it, because the nation state is no longer of any use to finance capitalism, globalism, whatever you want to call it. When people manage to have a say in how they're governed, it gets in the way of the pursuit of profit. So you get people like your man who's the CEO of BlackRock, who can sound terribly progressive and be called a neo-Marxist, and he's a billionaire, and he's totally in favour of the end of nation states. So it feeds into that idea of don't worry about your people as a whole, split yourselves up into individual minorities, and the idea of the Olympic idea of oppression And it actually helps them sweep over us, and they're the experts, and they make the decisions because they know what's best. They wrap themselves as progressives, but actually it's all in pursuit of as much wealth for them and as least for us as possible.
Thank you. Joan is actually speaking on the ESG banking panel later on, so do go and hear her if you enjoy that. Stephen, we're just going to whiz across the panel just for kind of quick comments. So, Stephen, anything you want to pick up?
Yeah, the comment by the gentleman over there resonates with me about how social media has exacerbated this problem, because we used to have to buy a stamp and write a letter to complain. Now you can ruin someone's life with a smartphone, well, you know, sat on the loo. I mean, that's my preferred method. Anyway, but I mean, it's become what's the equivalent of the 2 minutes hate now, and I think people need to realise that the digital world has a very short attention span, and companies and individuals perhaps shouldn't react to social media outrage. I think they should just give it the time to die down, and then the mob will be on to the new latest controversy the next week. So I think that there's a reaction issue to all this as well.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Remy, anything you want to pick up?
Yes, on the point about Dickens and the attempts to sort of cancel and all writers. So this is part of the struggle of those who have different answers to the questions of what was Britain in the past. So let's say what you'd call the woke side, and I would say that fundamentally there is nothing to be proud of in Britain's past, and that would include even writers like Dickens, etc., because they were most probably racists, possibly misogynists, definitely bad people, not the kind of people we'd want to support today. So that is part of that contestation. And it is up to those who disagree with that, as I take yourself, to try and battle that and say, actually, no, and you can give whatever reasons you want to give for that, and fight to still keep Dickens on the list. So that is a contest that is going to be going on, but it's up to those who think writers like that should be on the list to actually fight for that. It's part of this culture wars we're talking about.
Okay, thanks, Remy. Bruno?
Yeah, I think I wish it was just divisive. I think 2016 was an important moment, certainly, but I think the trends had been gestating for a long time, particularly in one area of life that's actually very important in Britain today, which is higher education. Around about 40% of kids go into higher education now. Now, if you look at those institutions, that's really the model that's emerging. That's the model that's emerging. That's the template which many people would like to apply to the whole of society. Now, education used to be very important, still is very important to a lot of people who have aspirations. Education is very, very important. It's very important to my parents. I didn't take it very seriously and left school at 16, but never mind. But now, education has been reconstructed. It's more about training people in the superior moral outlook than actual knowledge. It's training people to shut down rather than explore ideas. I mean, look at the new dark age that is emerging out of campuses. There are people, literally, a lot of young people today who believe a person can be born in the wrong body. Graduates who believe, these are what our universities are making today. Education becomes a stick to beat the majority, to beat the rest of us who aren't graduates. That's that's very, very bad today. I don't know if you've noticed all the university series. Whenever an election goes a bad way for the clerisy, it will always be explained that, of course, the people who voted this way are very poorly educated. Education itself has been torn down and turned into a weapon against society and community. That's the model that is emerging from this very corrosive, often episodic moment.
The University of Bath have only just published research showing that scientifically, people who voted Brexit had smaller brains. Or, literally happened last week, right?
Lower cognitive ability using a series of tests that are more or less predicated on sort of IQ, higher education.
Yeah, so here we get the return of eugenics enthusiastically being promoted by all these lefty liberals. You couldn't make it up. Anyway, Cheryl.
I'll try my best to answer these questions. My brain is very small.
Yeah, don't answer them all.
So, Jane's question about the cancelling of high culture. I think, I did say that it does get pulled into these things because of the dynamic, I think, of the culture war is to kind of politicise culture in every way. There's a sort of projection of all kind of present concerns, moral concerns onto everything. In the past, this week we found out that the plague was racist, right? And onto great art and to all kinds of things. And so there is this kind of hyper politics where everything becomes politicised in a sense, so that when everything is so political, nothing is political, right? Really, and so what kind of happens is that we just get stuck into that dynamic, and I do want to make the point that it happens on both sides, right? So if you look over in Florida in the United States, Ron DeSantis, who's the governor, was this great culture warrior against critical race theory in the schools and in the universities and everything. Talked about free speech and all of that. Sounded very good and whatever. And now he's banning it all, right? And he's kind of he's banning all this. That is not free speech when you ban things that you don't like. And so they are basically, I think the right are employing very similar kind of tactics to the left. And it closes down debate. It just locks it into this culture war of like my culture, your culture. We've got to fight for what's going to be on the curriculum or whatever.
Just one more point, Cheryl.
And I don't think it's the same point. And I don't think that this really I don't think we can get through that. We can't use this as a vehicle to make any better change. If we're going to argue for free speech, we have to say what it is that we want to use that speech for. We have to have some kind of vision of the future, as somebody said over here.
Okay, thank you. Great. Simon.
Two quick points. I mean, obviously I'm sympathetic to the idea of, conserving the best of the past. That won't surprise you coming from where I'm coming from. But I also, of course, see the dilemma that there are things that we got wrong. We have to give people a framework for examining that. But we have to actually be able to debate these things. And we have to actually have the idea that some things are true and some things are false. And these are kind of concepts that are being erased. And in terms of kind of giving the idea of a sort of a vision and a promised land, I think that is important, and I think that is very lacking in our politics. But the caveat I'd add to that is that I think it's very dangerous. Okay, so I've spent 27 years working in the political arena. I think politics is important, but I don't think it's ultimate. And one of the problems is you have a lot of people, especially younger people, for whom politics is ultimate. It's everything that they live for. And that's very dangerous. You have to have a much wider view of life than just fighting for politics all the time, because that's when you can justify saying and doing almost anything, because you've got to win, because it's the only thing you've got in your life. There is more to life than politics.
How dare you? Right, I'm going to take a handful of things. A dilemma I have, just if anyone wanted to comment. We've just seen some very ugly scenes in Dublin, the Dublin riots. And the thing that really struck me about that, and Lisa McKenzie and I have been discussing this over breakfast, as you do, because for some people politics is life, was the ease with which, very quickly, the people who were rioting, or what have you, were described as the far right. Now, as somebody who is regularly described as the far right, even though I'm actually from a Marxist background, consider myself on the left, but actually those labels are all a bit useless, there is a difficulty, which is there is genuinely some people on the far right. And let me tell you, I haven't been on the receiving end of them. I'm not particularly keen. But it's irritating when everybody's described as the far right, because you can't work out who the far right is if we're all far right. So I then get into a situation where I'm saying, actually, that is far right. And people say, no, we're all far right, so it doesn't matter. You know what it's like? I say, that's racist. And people say, well, they call all of us racist, so what's that? We are losing the capacity to describe reality in a way that's very unhelpful through the name-calling aspect. Because I think that actually doesn't help us. Because you do want to be able to... I thought what Simon just said there, it's not like as though you want to go, everything in Britain's past is a glorious, wonderful time of harmony. Do you know what I mean? Slavery, what's your problem? Do you know what I mean? Or slavery, we freed the slaves, so don't look at us. I mean, that's like as imbecilic as anything else, right? So we want to have complicated conversations, but you can't if we've got all this name calling going on. And I think we've all got to be wary of it. But how do people feel about that? Anyway, right, I was starting with Sandy, and then I've got you two ladies here, and then I'm moving through.
Okay, it's not an answer to that. No. But I'm interested in what any of the speakers think about a concept that's closely related to culture wars. Stephen alluded to it. It's the concept of capture in general and institutional capture in particular. Both sides use it, or if they're assuming there are two sides. And if we take this concept seriously, if we think, okay, an institution is captured, could be the police, could be the civil service, could be the educational institutions, Bruno mentioned the council of this, the regulator of that. What do you do about it? Do you uncapture it? Do you capture it for yourself? If you capture it for yourself, does the other side then try and capture it back off you? Is that the future of politics? You don't campaign for a policy, vote for a party you like, or stand for election yourself. You try and capture and recapture one another's institutions. That seems rather a bleak outlook to me. I'm interested in what anyone thinks about it.
Thank you, very interesting. Yes, where were we? Yes. It doesn't matter. Go on, yeah.
Hi, I'm from Liverpool and I'm involved with therapists. So I just wanted to say something with a group called Thoughtful Therapists is that, and I think it goes into other healthcare professionals, thinking about it's impossible to do your job. People are being trained in a way which narrows them down. They can't think about complexity or the dark side or rage or disgust or difficulty. It's all sort of sat on. So I think it was something about it actually being impossible to do the job, and we're actually cruel, and everyone's got to be kind, but actually I think we're being very cruel because we're not being rigorous enough.
Thank you. And here. So I see that from the next speaker that we've got a few TERFs in. All I can say is, I know it's usually used as an insult, I'll give it you as a compliment, and nice to see you.
I'll take it as a compliment.
Thank God for that.
Actually, I'm quite nervous about being seen dressed like this normally. And funnily enough, this is one place where I feel I can be dressed like this. I'm from Penrith, lived in London for a long time. But I just wanted to say thank you to the panel. My brain's exploding with all the different elements of the culture wars that you covered in your presentations. And I just wanted to flag up a couple very briefly. One of them is education. I think we're doing such a disservice to our children by saying to them that they can be in the wrong body because they only have the one body. And by putting them on a path to transition, we're putting them on a path potentially to sterility and not being able to have children themselves. And that's one thing. And the other thing that I picked up on was Remy's references to the Promised Land and a land of milk and honey. And I just wanted to say the other thing is this idea that we need to have racial equity. We need to lower our standards so that we can have more black people in positions of responsibility or in becoming doctors, lawyers. But I think we're doing everybody a disservice with that idea because we need to go on the content of people's character and people's merit, whatever the colour of their skin is. And that's so important. And also this idea of reparations. I don't think we could ever equal things up to satisfy people. But people who are saying they're disadvantaged because they're black, in America, for example, and they should have reparations, people should give them money. I think what they don't appreciate is that they might not exist. I'm not saying slavery is a good thing, but if that hadn't happened, they might not even exist. I mean, we're all so individual and so many things bring us about that if you start unpicking that, we might not exist. And we're in a great, comfortable society in many ways, which is why we're perhaps getting distracted with all these culture wars.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Okay. Right. So look.
Is the mic working?
Yeah. No. Speak directly into it, and people sort of shout a bit.
Is this actually the difference between people who are using language to communicate
and people who are using language to control.
Oh, very. Now that's what we call quick.
This is a question for Dr. Remy Adekoya. I may be playing devil's advocate here, but to a globalist, what is the use of various Nigerian tribal cultures?
I was really intrigued. I was really intrigued by what you said, Remy, and I thought it was an interesting perspective, especially when you started talking about what I would call the so-called left having a vision for the future, because I've always seen it as a lack of vision, so it was a different way of looking at it. But I thought, having come from an old left tradition myself, which is a Marxist tradition, which is actually, well, I think Marx was the highest of the Enlightenment thinkers, actually. It's an Enlightenment tradition where equality, tolerance and freedom actually go completely hand in hand. And I think the whole EDI stuff is the complete opposite of that. Although it's got equality in the words, it has nothing to do with equality. And I don't recognise, any of that tradition or any sort of vision for the future within it. And I thought that was really interesting. And I thought, just to comment on this idea of the left behind, I thought, well, it seems quite appropriate, actually, perhaps as a description of these people, because they are the arse end of the left. Yeah.
Thank you.
Historically, there's always been this tension between conservatives wanting to keep things as they are and progressives pushing against them. One of the wonderful things about this country is those tensions have in the main been resolved, and society has moved forward and become freer and more progressive and what have you. Seems to me that because there's a total collapse of the establishment and any conservative forces that have any sense of belief, any sense of purpose, or know what they're conserving, you just see this untrammeled progressivism that actually doesn't even know what it stands for. So it just creates new, whether it's climate change or you're born in the wrong body or what have you. So it's that. Okay, I'll talk into the mic.
Thank you for helpful, but don't be that unhelpful because we can't hear because you keep shouting. Right. If everyone could try and speak into the microphone and project.
I'll speak into the microphone. So you've had a total collapse of any of the establishment, a moral collapse of conservative forces, an untrammeled progressivism, which just latches onto new causes all the time. And the question really is how do we create, and you've got a younger generation that's brought up in a particular way to see things in a particular way. So how do we, particularly looking around the room, largely people of a certain generation who've experienced freedom in the arts, freedom in culture, who've known that, your parents actually have your best interests at heart and they're the people responsible for children. So you know what sort of normality is and what sort of norms society should have. But you can also experience the pleasures of freedom, and you know what those what they feel like. We have a generation that is being challenged on both those fronts. So it's just a big question as to how do we reach a new generation who hasn't lived, it doesn't have the genuine lived experience that we've got as an older generation of knowing what to value and what to conserve, and the real experience of what freedom means.
Okay, thank you. Very good challenge. Sheila, if you grab. Yeah.
Hello. This is mainly for Cheryl, I think. So, just thinking about Cheryl's piece, it seems counterintuitive to me to not pick a side, but I'm leaning into Cheryl's perspective. So, in the compulsory world of training courses and the laughable ignorance in them, just duck and dive with your employer because we've always done that. So the culture war is not the place for politics, I think I heard you say. I'm proud to say I failed my compulsory carbon literacy training at work. But it is exhausting to disagree with everything all the time, every day. And Cheryl, are there dangers in ducking, choosing?
Right, thank you.
I just wanted to say that people on the left or whatever with different views.
You really got to shout now.
Except people with certain colour, gender, education, age and so on, to be leaning on one side or the other. And when you're different, you sort of tend to get the kind of reaction that, why are you behaving in a particular way. You're brown or you're a girl or you're a woman and you're a certain age, and you should be sort of supporting the left. So even in the workplace, you get that kind of reaction and discrimination. So I think by doing all these things, the left people they're actually doing more damage to the society and the culture rather than sort of actually enhancing their views. So that's my thought.
No, thank you very much. There was a couple of... Yeah.
Hi. I don't know if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on this, but I'm convinced that the culture war is not an organic phenomenon, that it's been cultivated. Partly as a kind of divide and conquer, partly it's kind of indoctrinate us into a new secular religion or something. But I find the whole thing anti-enlightenment, that the very truth of science and stuff is up for debate, as the grievance studies hoax of James Lynch and Helen Pluckrose showed. They managed to get papers published by proper scientific publications on like rape culture in dogs and stuff like that, and they were taken seriously, So I think it's very important, because there's nothing more important, in my opinion, than being grounded in the truth.
Okay, thank you. So the lady in front.
Thank you. I just want to respond to Remy, who I think very appropriately said one of Britain's problems is that it doesn't have a vision for the future, which is something I feel very strongly as somebody living here. What is the vision post-2016 for the future? I don't know what I'm buying into. Point number one that I want to make. Point number two, just on the culture wars. As an average, decent citizen, I hope, I feel like I'm in an extra in West Side Story. You've got the Jets and the Mets, and occasionally the Mets say something that I can relate to, like, "Oh, the end of misogyny, yes please," and occasionally the other side says, "Oh, transgender, no thanks," and I'm thinking, "Yes please." So as an average citizen, I'm doing a kind of pick and mix between all of these things, and I think that's where I am politically. I can't relate to any of the political parties, which brings me on to the third point I want to make. The political system in Britain dates from the 1660s. It basically dates from the last Civil War, or the Civil War. It's time for the political system to get a massive overhaul so that people who want to express views can express views somewhere other than social media, can actually express views through the voting system. There are lots of examples across Europe and the rest of the world with really interesting voting systems where minority, marginalised groups can have a proportionate representation of their views. So please, could we look at that as part of the vision for the future?
Okay, thank you.
Hi there, thank you. Really fascinating discussion. One thing that strikes me about a lot of the discussions that take place in society is that they're very dismissive in nature. People are told that you're a bigot, and the refutation to that is, well, I'm not a bigot, but then that's what a bigot would say. And so it's kind of, there's no way of getting out of that argument. And because of that, it means that sort of dismissiveness, people, I think, take that on as, it sort of implies you're a bad person, because there's nothing you can say to refute it. And if you keep getting told you're a bad person enough times, you start to believe it eventually.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
I live in Scotland, in Dundee. You might not get that from the accent. And I often find that when I come south, people are sort of slightly envious of Scotland because they think there's some kind of political project going on there. So I just wanted to sort of, for the record, on this theme of a vision, if you look at the Scottish political class, you would think a nationalist party would have a clear vision, independence, supported by a green political party that wants to, deal with the environmental crisis. And yet, even though we have these political organisations that are running Scotland, the agenda that they choose to make their own and make a big issue about is the issue of transgender. And I think that's really symptomatic of an issue, that the culture wars is not a distraction or something that they do. Actually, the thing that really gets the political establishment, gives them a sense of purpose in Scotland, is looking back at the old Scotland and wanting to dismantle all of the prejudices and patterns of everyday life that existed there. So in Scotland, they didn't decriminalise homosexuality until 1981. I do find that shocking when I realise that. But Scotland was historically socially conservative. The SNP and the Greens have only one mission, really, and that's to dismantle what they see as social conservatism. But in reality, it's dismantling the patterns and beliefs of ordinary people in everyday life, and that's the elite project.
Okay, thank you. Right. One sentence each. Simon, a sentence.
Yeah, I'm going to answer 3 questions in one sentence. One, Sandy, I can't see how you can avoid the institutions constantly changing hands because they're never going to be neutral. The turf question, if you accept that description. I mean, I worked on the Gender Recognition Act in 2003, and you could foresee then, you know, that this was going to compel people's consciences and threaten women's spaces, but you could never have foreseen Bruce Jenner, and you could never have foreseen the impact on young people. And we're going to look back one day on this period and think that we completely lost our minds in terms of what we're doing to young people. And the third question is, I'm also not a bigot.
Okay, I want to say that there is no left anymore. Okay, so I don't know what people are talking about because there really is no left in this country, or probably in most Western countries. If you're talking about something like EDI or kind of administration, like the kind of workshops that you have to do and everything, the EDI stuff, that is administrative liberalism, right? That is not the left. And if you follow all of those to the T, you will not get any change. The other thing I want to say very quickly is that this question about the past and we need to conserve, and there's this kind of progressivism that's pushing to the future. I have some sympathy with that. But as a historian, I'm very interested in the past. And part of the reason is because I think if we don't take any notice of the past, we won't have a future. We need to be able to understand where we're going, the direction we're going in. And at the minute, neither side of the culture wars has any time for the past or the future. They just live in the present.
Thank you very much. Bruno.
Right, I think it's really, really important. This is because it's a modern fallacy. Politics, basic division in politics, has never been between progressives and conservatives. It's just simply not true. It's been a division in politics between democracy, people who are pushing for democracy founded on the notion of political equality, one person, one vote, versus institutions of aristocratic authority. Britain used to be ruled at the beginning of the 19th century by the magistocracy. Guardians, they were called. They were sort of judges and lay state officials. And in fact, the movement around here, actually, in High Peak towards Manchester, Disley, New Mills for Chartists and the nonconformists, they were actually protecting and conserving the institution of marriage, quite often against the poor laws when families were broken up. People wanted democracy to stop their lives and communities being disrupted by laws and forces outside of their control. The culture wars reinforce a reordering, which is reintroducing a modern magistocracy, very much in the form of higher education. It's reordering, it's changing the nature of our state because it's effectively abolishing and excluding us, the nation. So it's not about capturing institutions. The actual institutions themselves have changed. That's why when you get in control of them, you're in control of a weapon to beat us. The institutions have changed. What we are looking at is a symptom of the reordering of the state, away from it being a nation state, the great gain of the 20th century.
Thank you.
With regards to the question on EDI and the left that was asked about the movement away from Marxists, I think in some ways Britain is a victim of its own success. And the reason why the loud voices on the left today don't focus on economic issues but focus on more cultural kind of EDI issues is because many of the key economic issues in Britain have been resolved. People have access to healthcare and NHS. These were the struggles of the West 70, 80, 90 years ago. And these things have been resolved. The middle class is much bigger today in Britain than it was 70, 80, 90 years ago. And who drives the public debate in any society? It's the middle class, it's middle class intellectuals. So the middle class intellectuals writing articles around race and gender, etc., are generally materially quite comfortable. And so their priorities are not around material issues, they're around some of these more cultural issues. And so there's, like I say, Britain is in some ways a victim of its own success. Looking to the future, there was a character in Dostoevsky's novel, The Karamazov Brothers, who, arguing for the need, why he needed to believe that God exists, said because if there is no God, then that means anything goes. And what I just say is that what post-religious Britain needs going forward is a new secular 10 Commandments around which people can agree.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, sorry.
Stop clapping, we haven't got time.
Shut up! Yeah, this gentleman asked a great question about what to do about institutional capture, rather, and I don't know if I can do that justice, so I'll just have a brief whinge about something related. And that's, I think, that the biggest divide still in this country is class, and I've not felt that more than I have when I look at what's coming out of academia now. Our institutions, these very strange bourgeois luxury beliefs about privilege, about gender, and things like that. I mean, I think if the biggest struggle in your life right now is that there's a statue you don't like, you're living a fairly comfortable existence.
Right. Thank you very much. Right. I can't take everyone who wants to speak. I'm only taking, and I'm going to overrun, everyone's going to kill me. Right, quick, where are you? I'm taking 3 or 4, that's it, yes.
Cheryl, it's on your point about not taking sides. I get it, sort of, but isn't there a point in which there is a relationship between politics and our culture, in as much as don't we live the culture that we've built over time? We actually live it in our day-to-day lives. And isn't that the foundation around which a free and equal politics can exist? So I suppose I'm saying, through the culture wars, whilst it's frustrating, isn't it important to take sides because you're defending a way of life and you have to try to work out of those things which things matter. So in the past, people used to have just stupid discussions about what does it mean to be British. It would be fish and chips, warm beer and cricket. But when you actually start to come down to it over the last 20 plus years, you start to say, actually, there's some fundamentals that are really important to our way of life that are worth defending.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Thanks. I really liked your couplet, Cheryl, of who we are versus what we want. It seems to me that that's quite a useful way of looking at things, and I'd be very surprised if there was anybody in here who didn't despise the kind of who we are, victimizing, virtue signalling side of things, and who wasn't interested in what we want and the idea of changing things for the better. But I think the debate today surely is, if I can flip it round, to ask, can we get what we want without engaging in the discussion about who we are? I mean, that seems to me to be where we are. So I wanted to ask you, Cheryl and Remy, because you were talking about vision, do you recognise some of Bruno's concerns about the way that the culture wars is undermining the very possibility of that, getting to what we want to get to, getting to the future?
Right. You? Yeah. There.
Thank you, Claire.
Quick.
EDI is utter cobblers from start to finish, and I've worked in the industry for 10 years, I can assure you. They are the thieves of time. But what I thought might be interesting to ask the panel is, I've heard of a really good wheeze today that's being carried out in companies that have identified critical social justice nutters in their workplace, right? They go to the recruiter, and they pay the recruiter to headhunt them and send them to another company. I think that's genius.
And then on the back row, on the very back row, there's someone.
I live over in Rotherham, where the fear of being branded a racist meant that the rape of children was tolerated for at least 2 decades. And so I want to challenge this idea that the culture wars kicked off with Brexit and ask really whether the culture wars kicked off with Brexit, because that's when it started affecting more people.
Thank you.
Right. So I think in terms of the culture wars and everything, I think what people seem to be forgetting is that the culture wars started off with the Long March, with the I think it was Gramsci and hegemony, and what that led to
which my friend on the left over there would agree with me, is the erase of religion, the erase of the family unit, erase of community. And what we saw was that was from Labour during their reign, which kind of like cut up religion, cut up the family unit, and then we had Thatcher, who cut up the erase of community by getting rid of all the mining communities. And then in the 90s, we saw the promotion of individualism, which told everyone, you're an individual, you're a single person, you're not a collective person. And so everyone basically went on to find their own sources of pleasure, and it ended up in hedonism, which we end up seeing with all these stupid things like OnlyFans. Right. And that person called Nella.
Okay, we've got to stop there because we haven't got time for the rest of history. But it was very interesting. Thank you very much. In reverse order in which they spoke, our panel are going to give us their final thoughts. Bruno.
Right. I guess I can't do one of these without quoting from my two gurus, only one of them today, George Orwell. He described the English, and he described English, the roots of English patriotism very well. And being a patriot now is one of those very, very dangerous words. I really would, if you, in most workplaces or in most public utterances, I'd be careful about using the term patriot. But patriot lies much deeper than the sort of official symbols of a nation, although they're bound up with it. And Orwell wrote that the characteristic of the English, which is so much a part of us that we barely notice it, and that's the addiction to hobbies and spare time occupations, the privateness of English life. We're a nation of flower lovers, a nation of stamp collectors, pigeon fanciers, amateur carpenters, coupon snippers, darts players, crossword puzzle fans. All the culture that is most truly native centres around things that, even when they are communal and not official, the pub, the football match, the back garden, the fireside, the nice cup of tea. And he then goes on to talk about how the liberty of the individual is still believed in, almost as in the 19th century, but this has nothing to do with economic liberty, the right to exploit others for profit. It's the liberty to have a home of your own, to do what you like in your spare time, to choose your amusements instead of having them chosen for you from above. The most hateful of all names in an English ear, he wrote back in 1942, is Nosy Parker. Now that basic foundation of the people, its life, its culture, its lived traditions, is common to all nations and all peoples. And the real sharp edge of the culture wars isn't really on the official representations of patriotism, although it is there. It's the disruption of that notion of the people and the life, that private lived life, which isn't dictated to us from above. And the really dangerous aspect of politics today is an attempt to reorder the state through a dissolution, through the problematization of our daily lives that Orwell talked about in 42.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Seriously, don't clap. Remy.
Yes, so on the question of whether the culture wars are undermining that vision for the future I talked about, the answer would definitely be yes. The question is, how do we get out of this? Now, the only way I can think of getting out of this that humanity has fashioned and that appears to be the fairest way is the democratic principle. So the democratic principle of majority consensus around certain issues, like I said, around the secular 10 Commandments for Britain, which of course respects, as I would definitely want, the rights of minorities, whether they be political minorities or ethnic minorities or religious minorities or any other kind of minorities. But you, as the majority, have to come to some kind of idea of what those 10 Commandments should be. And then you have to push them, and then you have to defend them while respecting the rights of anyone who may disagree. It's really as simple as that. There's no other way around it. But that also takes courage. One key principle which I see emphasized in Britishness is the fairness principle. And this is sometimes used sort of against you, I'd say, because it's general knowledge for people who live in this society that you British people like to think of yourselves as a fair people. And so if someone wants to put you on the moral defensive or psychological defensive, what needs to be said is, oh, this is not fair. and then you come and say, oh, how is that not fair? And then, something can be gotten from that. So you have to come to some kind of consensus on going into the 21st century, 10 key commandments, what is fair?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Remy. Simon.
So I love these events because, of course, there's a variety of views and, people's respecting other people's rights to disagree. There's a basic kind of presumption of good faith on the part of the other people that you're talking to. And there's a common, what we have in common is the idea that there's a basis of truth or truthfulness as a basis for the conversation. What worries me about the kind of culture war is that, in the terms I was talking about them, is the way in which actually they're drifting into a kind of a low-level dehumanizing of their opponents. And that's very dangerous territory. And so I think if we are going to, win, as it were, our side of a particular kind of culture war, we have to maintain that belief that in the worth and the dignity of the person that you're talking to, that belief that they've got kind of freedom and agency to make their own minds up, because that's a basis on which people can be persuaded and appealed to, and I think that's the key.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl.
Yeah, I want to talk about truth as well, because I think truth is often said to be the first casualty of war, and the culture wars really have kind of taken it down. And once people are in their cultural bunkers, they are speaking as a whatever part of their group, and they are received that way too. So it's a problem, and they don't want to entertain evidence from or arguments from the other side. Instead, they just dismiss the other side as kind of disingenuous or ignorant, stupid, racist or whatever, far right. And we saw that with Brexit. I don't think the culture wars started with Brexit, but they certainly came to the fore in this country. They've been going on in the States for a long time. But if you think about Brexit as well, it goes for the Remain side as well, because they weren't all elitist snobs or whatever. I had a very good friend who deeply believed in the EU as a positive project, and you need to be able to listen to people that you disagree with rather than demonize them. And because otherwise the standard of public debate is undermined, civility is lost, and many friendships are ruined. So probably the only way to get to the truth about anything is to talk to people who you disagree with. I want to defend Enlightenment values of reason and freedom and democracy and justice for all, and especially free speech, but not in a kind of culture wars way, not in and of themselves, for themselves, in an abstract sense, with no end in mind. All of the great free speech defenders in history, in the past, have had something that they wanted to achieve with their speech, which is usually why other people wanted to close that speech down, right? Abolitionism, union rights, women's vote, whatever. We need to think seriously about what we want in the future, what we want to do, and find ways to build a better future. Because I don't think there is a solution to the culture war simply by defending the gains of the past. So 3 things. Focus on what we have in common, not what drives us apart. Focus on what we want, not who we are. And we have to have difficult conversations. I think Brexit was a good start to that conversation, but it seems to have been put under the rug now. Final point. On being stuck where we are at the moment. We do need to kind of try to generate some political imagination. Mark Fisher said, we can imagine the end of the world with our environmental scenes better than we can imagine an alternative to capitalism. So do we want no future, or do we want a better future?
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly. First, thank you to the lady from Rotherham to bringing up the stifling effects on freedom of expression due to grooming gangs. I did actually have a few sentences about that, but I thought segueing straight from the Manchester Arena bombing into grooming gangs may have lost some of the... But there's been a bit of talk here about the loss of religion, and I think what they're really talking about is the loss of monotheism, because when I look around, these new progressive ideologies are some of the most religious I've ever seen, which ties into this lady's point here about controlling language. To me, this is indistinguishable from blasphemy codes. So as secularists, I think we should, demand the right to be exempt from these things, whether these religions are godless or otherwise.
Thank you very much. Right.